Evening.
Okay. Is the strive for net zero destroying the Scottish economy, what with no new offshore drilling and the closure of Grangemouth suddenly?
Thank you, Andrea. Last week's closure of the Grangemouth refinery. Just today, Britain's biggest offshore oil and gas producer, Harbour Energy, announced 250 jobs going in Aberdeen. Megan Gallagher, those job cuts by Harbour Energy as a result of excess taxation, they said, namely the windfall tax, which the Conservatives introduced.
Well, if I may address the lady's question initially, in short, absolutely, because we have a Scottish Government whose presumption against oil and gas is preventing new oil fields from opening. That means that we've got less jobs. Of course, jobs are on the line in the northeast of Scotland as well.
Well, they went today because of a policy the Conservatives introduced, windfall tax on oil and gas companies.
Well, of course, that's why I'm answering the question from the lady directly, because there is an issue here when it comes to net zero, when it comes to how we look at net zero, but also how we address the issues that we are seeing right across the country. And, I believe in terms of the job losses, I feel for every single family that's impacted by those job losses, but we must stop the push to net zero without it being affordable for the ordinary working man and woman on the street. And I think that's what all political parties should be looking at, particularly when we're looking at our net zero targets. And I think that's something that the Scottish Government really has to reconsider when it comes to looking at net zero and how to tackle it.
Brian Leishman, you've campaigned long and hard for Grangemouth. Isn't the reality that net zero comes at a price? It comes at a cost, and that's what we're seeing.
What we've seen with the closure of Grangemouth is not because of a government's passion for net zero. It highlights the primary problem that we have is not being in charge of our own energy security and nationalising vital pieces of infrastructure that we rely on. It's a combination of the owners of the Grangemouth refinery, it's a combination of INEOS from Sir Jim Ratcliffe and also PetroChina, the Chinese state petrochemical wing.
But there's declining demand for what's produced. That's the reality.
The reality is that oil and gas will still be part of the energy mix for decades to come. And what we've got to do is we have to provide, and this is incumbent on both governments, we have to provide a proper just transition, which, to be honest, is just two words cobbled together that mean nothing at the moment. Because what we've seen at Grangemouth is the definition of an unjust transition. What we've got to do, both governments have got to do, is they have got to appreciate and learn the lessons from 4 decades ago. We saw the mass deindustrialisation of Scotland through the mines closing. We have learned no lessons. What we need to do is we do need to build energy renewables for the future, the green industrial revolution that the planet will need. But what we've got to do is we've got to make sure that those jobs are ready before things like the Grangemouth oil refinery closes. And that's the definition of a proper just transition.
Ian Anderson, Grangemouth lost $1 billion over the past 13 years. As a businessman, would you have kept it open?
Yeah, so I think the whole problem here, Stephen, is that lack of long-termism. Back to the point that gentleman raised earlier. I mean, I would say this, but I think we need more business people in government that understand the balance sheet, that understand the dynamics. Because if we had more business people in government, Stephen, we could have got ahead of this situation. I think the problem in Grangemouth, the problem, and I'm an Aberdonian too, and I feel...
But you're a businessman, first and foremost. Yeah, would you have kept it open at that cost?
So the problem is the incentives and the regulation in the system. And when I say about governments going faster, and your point, Brian, about getting governments here in Scotland and UK to go faster, that's what we need to do, because then businesses can invest. Now, what do we have, and I am hopeful for, to try and push forward and be hopeful, is an investment plan for the country, an industrial strategy, and part of that industrial strategy taps into exactly what you're talking about, Brian. But my ambition is that this goes much faster because it needs to.
Siobhan Brown, you've been running Scotland, the SNP, for nearly 20 years. Have you been too slow to plan for what's happening?
I don't believe so. You'll know that energy is reserved. First of all, can I just commend Brian? I think, Brian, you were elected last year on the promise of change and saving Grangemouth and bringing down energy costs. And I know that you have been very vocal on this issue and talking against your party and standing up for your constituents, which I find very admirable. One of the things with the just transition that I believe that in Scotland we need to do is we've seen the UK government prioritise jobs at Scunthorpe, close down Grangemouth. 2 projects for carbon capture in England have got the green light from the UK government. We need the UK government to step up and to commit to the ACORN project, which will open up jobs at Grangemouth and also in the North East as a matter of urgency.
Let me hear from the audience on this. Young man in the navy top, yes.
Well, first of all, the closure of Grangemouth was not just a tragedy, but in my view, it was another instance of Scotland losing its sovereignty. The fact of the matter is that Grangemouth was a primary supplier of Scotland's main airports, and it was a supplier of 70% of Scotland, Northern Ireland and Northern England's petrol and diesel stations. It supplied 3,000 jobs, 500 direct, about 2,500 indirect. It was very crucial in being a major part of Scottish manufacturing. It made up as much as 8% in some cases. It made up 14% of the UK's total refining capacity. It supplied around 2/3 of all refined products in the UK. So the fact that it was an absolute tragedy and a loss of a major strategic asset. And while I commend you, Brian, for actually raising the issue, fighting for it, the fact of the matter is the Scottish Labour MSPs voted against a motion that would hold Grangemouth to the same standard as the Labour government did to Scunthorpe for British Steel down in Westminster. And the fact that it hasn't been raised like that with the rest of your party is an absolute disgrace as far as I'm concerned.
Brian Leachman.
Again, I'll be honest with you, yes, I was disappointed to see that vote last week, but not as disappointed and appalled at the lack of action that the UK government, and to be honest, and the Scottish government, both governments are complicit. Now, I understand as well the energy being reserved issue, but it is the primary responsibility of every government to look after its citizens. Now, we are now in the absolutely criminal position that 5.5 million people in Scotland will now be relying on importation of fuel. Now, what that also means, it means it's going to severely impact not just our energy security, but also our national security. At a time where war still rages on in Europe, we see serious global volatility, and as we touched on, I think, in the first question, we see serious global volatility in the political sphere as well. It is the wrong decision. Both governments should have done an awful lot more. Now, I've been very critical of the Labour government in its first 10 months, but let's be honest as well. What we've seen is no one's hands are clean on what happened at Grangemouth. 10 months we've been in. It's not a problem that the Labour government created, but it certainly was on our desk to sort, and we haven't done enough. But let's be honest as well. 3 years ago, the SNP were made aware of this situation. The local MSP was I think it was the Cabinet Secretary for Energy and Net Zero at the time, did nothing. There was no engagement with the workforce, there was no engagement with the trade union, there was no engagement with Petro Ineos. They knew about the planned closure in Q2 2025. And the Conservative government at Westminster stuck their head in the sand and frankly did not want to know. This is a failure of the entire political class.
All right, Siobhan Brown, why didn't you do something about it then?
I think that from my understanding, and apologies, I was not in the government then, so I don't know the history, so I can't comment on that, to be 100% honest. But I accept what Brian's saying there, and I think it is a huge tragedy. But as I said, the Scottish government are ready to invest in the ACORN project, and we need the UK government to step up.
But that's no consolation for the jobs lost at
Grangemouth.
But
they could open up jobs in Grangemouth. It could lead to more jobs in Grangemouth and the North East.
Callum Steele?
I think the question was about the cost of going to net zero. And I think that if the benefits of net zero were being felt in the pockets of those of us that live in the country, then it would be less of a controversial issue than it is just now. We all know that wind blows for nothing, that the sun shines for nothing, yet the cost of the energy created by the wind and solar is sold on the open market at the price of gas. Now, if we, as individuals, were able to get energy benefits from the renewable sources that are a consequence of the move to net zero at an affordable cost, then the great antagonism against the move to net zero wouldn't exist. It would disappear significantly. And the reason there is so much opposition to things like moving to air source heat pumps is again because of the exorbitant cost of them set against a gas-fired combi boiler, for example. So there's always going to be reticence where individuals feel that they are being punished for the decisions being taken by the state rather than being the beneficiaries of those decisions. So in that sense, you can understand why the label of net zero is the target. But if you look at it more holistically, you realise that it's not just the net zero aspect of it, because ultimately we're all going to have to move in that direction in any event if we want to have a planet to hand down to our grandchildren and their grandchildren. It's the fact that we are paying through the nose for the costs of doing that in the short term, and as has been correctly identified, we're going to increase the costs, actually work against our own carbon reduction targets in doing so by importing oil and gas and refined products when we have the facility on our doorstep.
Let's wrap this up with the audience. Man in the check top, yeah.
At least twice tonight we've heard reference to people being who should be have a good business acumen at the top, or at least in charge of things. Is that not just describing Nigel Farage? What do we want? Really?
We've come full circle.